Another factor that was behind the unpreparedness for war in 1914 was the fact that there hadn't been a large scale war since 1815, 100 years prior. There had been a couple conflicts in the 19th century between the great powers and a lot of small ones, but no huge ones that lasted a really long time. So, an example of one of the wars that it did occur in the 19th century between great powers was the conflict that basically created modern Germany, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71, in which Prussia, which is a part of what is now Poland, what was then part of the North German Confederation, they the leader of that country, Otto von Bismarck, he basically tempted France to go to war, and it did, which it was very unprepared to do. And after a series of battles in northeastern France, the Prussian army was able to lay siege to Paris, which caused a lot of damage and in hunger and hardship. And so there was a lot of anger about that, even though it was a relatively short war, lasted not even a year. But the experience of the siege of Paris, in particular, led people to the average people to be opposed to the idea of war, at least for a while. And then in the 20th century, it got more popular again. This painting here represents the desire of a lot of French people who had lived through the hardships of that siege of Paris, wanting to get over it and move on and not have a similar conflict. So that was one aspect behind it. Also, the fact that the wars, like the Franco-Prussian War, had been so successful for the winners. The Germans uh, were quite pleased with the outcome. Obviously, it helped create their empire, and French leadership were upset over losing two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. So the lack of a total war in the 19th century also led to kind of a negligence leading up to 1914, and a lot of the leadership of Europe thought that any war that broke out would be like the Prussian Franco-Prussian War. It would be over within a year or less. A lot of the people that thought that or didn't think enough about it were the ruling classes of the European countries who, like I said, it was ancient thinking in some ways. So Kaiser Wilhelm there with his wife and son in their younger years. Uh, Kaiser Wilhelm had become the king of the German Empire after the Franco-Prussian War united the North and South German confederations as a country, and he was from a royal family with deep ties to royalty in Europe, but was very insecure, both as an individual and as representative of the family. So the Hohenzollern family that Kaiser Wilhelm came from was a landed family that went back hundreds of years in the area somewhat east of Berlin. But they had only become monarchs relatively recently in the late 18th century, and there was one monarch, Frederick the Great, who they had to live up to. And by the time Wilhelm took the throne of the now combined Germany in 1871, he had a lot to prove. He wanted to prove that his country was up and coming, and he wanted to prove that his family was up to the task of ruling it. And that, for him, that was a big deal because he had a withered left arm. Uh, for someone to have such an injury like that, or such a defect, when he's supposed to be from a line of warrior kings, was extremely difficult for his family to deal with and for him. And he tried to compensate in a number of ways. One way he compensated was by wearing gaudy uniforms. He loved to play dress up with uniforms, and it was said he would change his clothes 5 or 6 times a day to wear a costume fitting for the event. But the overdressing was one way he compensated for the defect, and so that was one aspect of kind of the moribund nature of the European political system, is that you've got the country being run by someone who's uh, not really all with us, but he did have a son who he expected to become emperor himself after Wilhelm passed on, and so it seemed like the family was strong, and he was determined. Wilhelm was determined to keep the family strong. One way he felt he could do that was to compete with Britain in terms of naval production, which actually made things worse and led Germany closer to war with Britain. Another example of kind of the ruling classes that were out of touch was the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph, and he was simply old and not really not really able to wrap his head around the rapid changes in the economy and in society that were going on in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was breaking apart essentially. And he had led the country for a long time. He had led it for decades by that point. He was simply not up to the task in a lot of ways, and was really determined to keep the country as traditional as possible. He resisted a lot of technological changes, resisted a lot of cultural changes, even though they very much needed to happen. So, again, someone stuck in the past, or trying to live up to the past. The most backward of any of the ruling classes was the Romanov family, uh, led by Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. They were by far uh, the most egregious example of being stuck in the past. Russia had been going through significant changes. They had that attempted revolution in 1905, and the ruling class's response was to try to repress the normal citizens. There were a series of reforms to try to release the pressure, but the monarch got more and more unpopular as time went on in Russia. And when Russia went to war in 1914 and the war didn't go well, a lot of people took their anger out on the Tsar himself, as in blaming him for the crisis. And he was not able to focus as much on running the country as he would have liked. He wasn't that competent, and his family was obsessed with their own health. The Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, she had become or fallen under the spell of this monk who was essentially a con man. He called himself a faith healer, and his name was Grigory Rasputin. And he had met the royal family through church connections in the early 1900s, and they had somehow gotten connected because of the youngest son's uh, health problems. He was hemophiliac, and so any little injury could possibly kill him. He would hemorrhage and have this internal bleeding, and it was difficult for him. And they thought it a number of times in the young boy's life he was going to die. And Alexandra, the mom of Alexei, the little boy, uh, she thought that Rasputin had these amazing powers that could heal the boy. And so she kept him in the royal family's entourage and kind of let him take over some governmental operations, which became this huge scandal in Russia and evidence that the Tsar was not really in control of even his own family, let alone the country. And Russia in general, its political system was just stuck in the past. Serfdom was still, or had only just been gotten rid of a few years prior. There was a ton of inequality, which was terrible, while the king himself, the czar himself, was extremely wealthy, and all that would come to explode later in the 19 teens. But they're a great example of just being out rulers that were out of touch with what was going on in the world. Some other warning signs going on. Um, Similar to the working class protest movement, and in some cases a lot of overlap, there was a movement across a lot of the Western nations to give women more civil rights, in particular the right to vote. And that caused a number of large scale protests, caused a lot of societal instability, or was representative of kind of societal brittleness, you might call it. And the fact that a lot of these countries had been investing in women's education for quite a few decades, the US among them, yet 20th century was here and women still had very few, if any, rights. And they started agitating more and more. You'll see in the video the protest that led to the death of one of the more prominent suffragette activists in Britain when she made this protest that got her killed against the king. And so that was representative of kind of societal churn that that was unstable because the ruling system of the countries was unable to respond to movements like this, unable or unwilling.